Okay, everyone, sorry about that. Yeah, because I only could do 30-minute videos and I went over. So I'm just gonna finish this and then finish the rest. Okay, hopefully with this in 30-minute time frame. Oops, sorry about that. Okay, so then as to get back to this, so then this is what as I mentioned, so the skeptics don't believe that capitalism is a thing, that it's more about regional agreements because you probably heard of NAFTA, the North American Free Trade Agreement, or the European Union, or there's LAFTA, which is the Latin American Free Trade Agreement. And then there's also the ASEAN, SASEAN, which is the all major Asian economies, right? So there's ample evidence to suggest that there are more regional agreements than like globalization, right? But just to sort of let you know, me personally, I consider myself a hyper globalist, right? Because I do believe that globalization is real. Okay, that just to sort of just that's just for you for your general information. But okay, so then this is what the OECD is. So the OECD is the Organization of Economic Cooperation and Development, and this is the world's largest economies, like the United States, Great Britain, and Europe, and Japan, and I can't remember some other countries, but the OECD are the major global economies, right? So then, what the skeptics would say is, yeah, there may be globalization, but it's only confined to these countries or these regions because Mexico is not necessarily considered an OECD, all right, or Nigeria or Vietnam, right? So so then that's sort of like the differences, and then everything else is just based on regional agreements. Because I actually heard someone say this yesterday that they wanted to do because I actually wrote this down. So it was and this agreement is considered it's called MECA, MECA. And the MECA would be the regional economies of Mexico, Europe, Canada, and Australia, if I remember correctly, that they would become one economic unit and they would actually be able to compete against like China. But then the interesting thing about it is that it does not include the United States, right? Because of our current person who's in 1600 Pennsylvania Avenue. And if you don't know what that is, that's the address of the White House in Washington, D.C., and its current occupant who lives there currently, right? And when well, I'll talk about like his tariffs when I talk about the supranational institutions. Okay, so then that's sort of like the difference between skeptics and hyperglobalists. So comparing hyperglobalists and skeptics is very easy. The next group that I'm going to introduce to you, the transformationalists, it's a little more nuanced argument, right? Because you could sort of take a transformationalist and a hyper globalist, and both of them would agree that globalization is a thing. And then we go to the transformationalist page or slide. And so a transformationalist would agree with the hyper globalist that globalization is real, but the difference, the nuanced difference between a transformationalist and a hyper globalist is this. To begin with, it is crucial to acknowledge that globalization does not simply denote a shift in the extensity or scale of social relations and activity. Much more significantly, argue the transformationalists, it also involves the spatial reorganization and rearticulation of economic, political, military, and cultural power. And David Held and McGraw, if I do remember, because it's been a while since I read their stuff, or their writings, they are transformationalists. Okay. And then the current debate about globalization ought primarily to be about the question of power. It modulates instrumentalities, organization, and distribution. Globalization can thus be understood as involving a shift or transformation in the scale of human social organization that extends the reach of power relations across the world's major regions and continents. So, if you did a comparison between transformationalists and hyperglobalists, you would notice that they do talk about economic power, but it's not the central argument that a transformationalist would make as compared to a hyperglobalist. This is why, as I mentioned on Wednesday, that we have to be able to prepare ourselves to be able to think in three dimensions, or to think in multiple modalities other than just the way we tend to think ourselves. Right. Okay. So then this is what this means. Um, uh, because one of the things that tries to or show like this reorganization, rearticulation of economic, political, and cultural power is this: the world's middle class and the world's working class have more in common with each other than they do with the elite in each respective country's borders. Right. And this is what I mean. How many of us can actually relate with Trump or Elon Musk or Peter Thiel or the Mercers, right? And these are billionaires that live here in the United States. These individuals would not give us the time of day, right? But working class families like in South Korea have more in common with working class in the United States than they might do with their political elites, right? Or Mexico and Canada. So globalization has allowed a new type of connections being made where connections were not existent prior to the establishment of the system around the 1960s, 1970s until today. Right. Um, but also, you can look at like political power, right? Politically, under the old system, under the old international system, the only major players that actually had legitimacy in the international system up until around the 1990s were governments. And there were no other organizations or individuals that had the ability to exert any type of influence until, right, Elon Musk, or actually the first person that actually had like global influence was Bill Gates, with Microsoft and his tech company. During the 1990s, Microsoft was a dominant force where Bill Gates opened the Bill and Melinda Gates Foundation, where they've donated like billions or trillions of dollars to a lot of different causes. Bill Gates is a firm believer in technology solving a lot of human problems. Right. So that would be an example of politics. Or as I mentioned, like Elon Musk, or I mentioned Elon Musk, like I think the first or second day that we met, where he went to Germany, or he did a FaceTime in Germany where he was telling the AFD. And if you recall, the AFD is the modern version of the Nazi Party of the 21st century, because the founder of the AFD had family members who were part of the original Nazi Party in Germany in the 1930s and 40s. All right, so there's a clear genetic connection between the AFD and Nazism in Germany. And that's when Elon Musk, as I mentioned in class prior, that Elon said, "Why should you still be held responsible for the sins of your father?" Right, literally saying like you shouldn't worry about the stigma of how Germans or how Nazism killed 6 million Jews, or that it started the war and it literally destroyed Europe's position and then in the world, but also just destroyed Europe. Period. Right. So now Elon Musk has huge influence because of the type of money, but also the things that he does, because a lot of his money comes from different government contracts around the world. All right. And he's starting to interfere in a lot of political decisions of different countries. Right. Or militarily, we could look at like the development of the hypersonic missile. Right. Russia, China, and the United States are trying to create a hypersonic missile that would travel from one part of the world to the next within maybe 30 minutes, and to be able to drop a chemical bomb or a nuclear bomb. Right. So then these technologies actually threaten the viability of the world, right? Because of the destructive magnitude of the nuclear technology that we have today. Because a nuclear weapon today, if I remember correctly, is about 100 to 1,000 times more powerful than the bomb that were dropped on Hiroshima and Nagasaki in the 1940s. Right. Excuse me. Or the cultural power. Right. Yeah. We could talk about like the westernization of the world, or the Americanization of global culture, which is a thing, and it can be studied. But also importantly, you could have like counter cultural currents, right? Where you have like music forms from different parts of the world infiltrating into the United States. Like during the late 1990s and early part of the 2000s, there were a lot of songs that incorporated Middle Eastern tunes and melodies, right? Because of the those types of cultural exchanges. And then I think the first day that we oh no, the second day, because I couldn't get in the computer, I played the song by Renata Flores when she sang Alicia Keys' song. I forgot the song that she sang. But you remember, right? She sang it in Quechua, which is the Incan language. Or when I played the other song that she translated to Quechua, was Michael Jackson's "The Way You Make Me Feel." Right. And then I asked you, how many of you know either song by Alicia Keys or Michael Jackson, sort of sang along because you're familiar with the song and you sang along with the melody, even though that you may not have necessarily understood what Renata was saying in Quechua. Right. So like those are like examples, okay, of how the transformationalists would look at globalization. And then they'll say the current debate about globalization will primarily be about the question of power, its modalities, instrumentalities, and organization and distribution. So you could look at how like a country like the United States is able to exert its power, right? And how lesser powerful countries are able to speak back to the United States or to other political global powers. So, for example, when Russia invaded Ukraine about 2 years ago, there was an African leader that criticized the Russia's invasion of Ukraine, and he akined it to how Europe colonized Africa in the 18th and sorry 19th and 20th century. And he said we should have been done with the era of imperialism because we know how destructive this process is. Right? It not only destroys destroys the by the invading country, or sorry, the country that's being invaded, but it also destroys the invading country itself because it has to waste blood and treasure to try to fight the war that it started. And that's one of the issues that Putin is having right now, right? Because I heard some data not too long ago that for every one Ukrainian killed in Ukraine, 5 Russian soldiers are killed. And that's a number that the Russian military cannot sustain. So then what's happening in Russia right now, they started to draft indigenous community members to fight for in the war in Ukraine. right? So Putin is in a type of crisis because a lot of the things that he thought he was going to be able to accomplish when he invaded Ukraine is not happening, right? So that's one way. Another way of how like organizations, now we have what is it, non-governmental organizations that are able to exert some type of influence, like governments as well as individuals like Elon Musk or Bill Gates, right? Like, oh, I'm trying to remember, like Human Rights Watch. So Human Rights Watch, what they'll do is like they'll write reports on different governments that abuse their power and their citizens, or like Oxfam. Oxfam is a nonprofit, non-governmental organization that tries to solve the issue of global inequality and poverty. Okay, so then you start to begin to see the complexity of globalization and how it differs, at least from a transformationalist perspective, from the old international system, right? And that's pretty much what the transformationalists believe. So then your task is just to be able to identify and represent these groups' ideas. Okay, so let me go to the next slide before I run out of time. All right, so then this is the supranational institutions that encompass the entire planet, and these are the economics. So this is the World Trade Organization, the World Bank, the International Money and the International Monetary Fund, and the Bank of International Settlements. So these are the three or four institutions that regulate globalization, and the one that actually has the most power is the World Trade Organization. Because all right, and I haven't really looked into this, but I really need to look into this because as Donald Trump says that he's going to impose so many percent tariffs like on China, Mexico, Canada, or any country that disagrees with him, I'm pretty sure the general secretariat of the World Trade Organization, his head is exploding, or their heads are exploding at the World Trade Organization, because the main objective of the WTO is to ensure that governments do not impose unnecessary economic regulations that can disrupt global trade. Because even though that we have global capitalism or global trade, it is a very delicate system. Case in point, remember COVID and the cost of items, and how certain items actually went down because we weren't necessarily going out shopping on a regular basis because, being afraid of contracting COVID, or just that not that many workers were out, so you had all these things that we had to do during COVID. But then once we started going back to sort of normal life, how things increased, and part of it was all of the shipping containers that were in blockage, because it literally took like a year, almost a year, I think, or exactly a year, to try to get through all the products, the shipping containers that were in off the coast of the port of Long Beach in San Pedro. It wasn't not only here in the United States, but also in other parts of the world, right? So the World Trade Organization is trying to maintain free trade, right? And then you have the World Bank, and they're like the lenders of money, of developmental money around the world, right? So that's the World Bank, and then you have the International Monetary Fund, and what they do is they sort of uh, negotiate agreements, and once the International Monetary Fund does these agreements, then the World Bank and the World Trade Organization enter into the picture, because the International Monetary Fund would say something like, if you want to become part of globalization, you need to change your constitution and how you do business in your country. And then the IMF would sort of look and say, yeah, you've done those changes, and they would sort of give them the stamp of approval, and then they can go to the World Bank where they can get money from them, and then become part of the World Trade Organization. All right, and then the Bank of International Settlements, is to make sure that there's consistent banking policy around the world, or banking and financial policy around the world, where you could have like seamless economic trading, right? So because I don't want to spend so much time, because I don't want to run out of time and be able to get to the last slide. So that's sort of like the in a nutshell what these organizations do. Oh, and then the next one is the United Nations, and this is a supranational organization, but it's political, where the United Nations is supposed to be the forum where all countries are able to meet and have redress of grievances, and the main goal of this organization is literally to try to prevent World War III. When this organization was created, it was created after World War II, and it was structured under the principles of the US Constitution and the Bill of Rights. Excuse me. Right. So, but the United Nations has a lot of different divisions. Like they have peacekeeping mission, they have missions like to try to deal with poverty, childhood poverty, try to maintain and control disease, try to ensure that women get protections and the resources that they need so they can get out of poverty themselves. So they have a very extensive program, or programs, to help different peoples around the world. Okay. And then lastly, sorry, is the transnational state. And the transnational state is sort of looking at these large economic institutions, or organizations. So you have the G7, the G20, and the World Economic Forum. The G7 is the seven largest economies that meet every year to sort of set the what's going to be the following year's economic plan. Right. Russia was part of it, right? And the only reason Russia was allowed to become part of it is because they were a superpower, but when the Soviet Union collapsed and they started re what is the word I'm thinking of? Reinvigorating their economy, they were eventually allowed into the G7. But when Russia invaded Ukraine in 2014, Russia was kicked out of the G7, and Putin has been mad ever since. Right. So then that's the G7, and then the G20, of course, is the world's largest economies, where they meet during the spring. So I'll talk about them more once they start meeting during the semester, and they talk about again what's going to be the economic plan, what's going to how our negotiations are going to occur, and the type of policy coordinations that's going to exist between the different countries. All right. Because of the war, Russia invading Ukraine, there's been tension in the G20, where Russia has been ostracized. Right. So then there's a lot of like political issues that I won't get into to bore you to death. And then finally is the World Economic Forum, and they're responsible to and they're an organization where the richest people and the most influential people meet every year in Davos, Switzerland, and they pretend, right, to care about the poverty or the planet, but they really don't do anything to try to mitigate a lot of the things that they say that they want to mitigate, right? Like poverty or like climate change, right? So, but what they do, it's kind of strange how they sort of set up their meetings, because you have to buy into the different levels. So you have like regular level, but then you have to pay like hundreds of thousands of dollars to be able to access these different parts of the World Economic Forum. So it's a very exclusive organization, and none of us would ever be allowed to go there, because in order to get to Davos, you literally have to take a helicopter ride to get to the resort, which is in the Alps of Switzerland. Okay. All right, so sorry. So that's pretty much it. So I'm going to stop here, and I'm gonna post this on YouTube, and hopefully it makes sense. And then if anyone has any questions, just let me know in class, and I'll try to explain it more. Okay. So I'll see everyone on Wednesday.